John Hart was born in 1741 to a Jewish family in England. Jews were a minority in England at the time, but generally weren't oppressed too harshly as they were white. Before he was sent for transportation, John Hart was a member of the British Army, but by the time he was discharged, he had worked his way up the rank to sergeant. After he was discharged, he began working as a porter. He likely would have worked for wealthy people who could have afforded to have a servant working for them. John was sent to Australia because he stole a basket of food. It may have been from who he was working for, or from a shop. He probably would have stole it because he could not afford to buy his own food and needed to eat something. He was put on trial on the 12th of January 1785 at the Old Bailey in London. It was a major criminal court in London and was attached to a jail. For stealing the basket of food, he was sentenced to transportation for 7 years. The value of the basket of food was 12 shillings, or about $225 today, or worth about 0.075 of an Adelaide Metro bus take ZDI. John Hart was 46 years old when he departed England, making him one of the older convicts in the First Fleet. He was transported on the ship Scarborough. She was built in 1782 in Scarborough, England. 34 metres long, or about 2.5 Adelaide Metro bus tank CDIs, and 10 metres wide. She was a 3-masted cargo ship and she was chartered to the Admiralty for the journey. The journey was about 24,000 kilometres long, or about 1,920 Adelaide Metro bus tank ZDIs, which if arranged in a line between London and Sydney would make Adelaide Metro very unhappy. It took more than 250 days, or more than 8 months, stopping in Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town for supplies. She sailed with 208 male convicts on board. The conditions on board Scarborough were cramped and unhygienic. There were many cases of seasickness and disease. Many people died of typhoid and cholera on board, and the ship's surgeons worked overtime to keep conditions best they could. John Hart was one of only a few Jewish convicts on board the First Fleet, somewhere between 8 and 16. However, within the first months of landing at Botany Bay, he married a woman called Flora Lara, whose age is unknown. Another Jewish convict, and who was described as evil and possessed in court records. Even though they were Jewish, they blended in well with the newly established colony, as they were white. Botany Bay turned out to be a poor place to set up a new colony, and instead operations were moved to nearby Port Jackson under the guidance of Arthur Phillip. It was due to him that the colony managed to survive through its first hard years. In early life of the colony, all people were required to attend Anglican church services on Sundays, as well as attend Anglican-controlled schools. As Jews only made up 1% of the colony, they weren't enough to start their own place of worship until the 1800s. John and Flora were transported to Norfolk Island in 1789 on the HMS Supply. It was hoped that Norfolk Island would be an economic boost for the colony, as it had a large population of flax and pine trees, as well as to relieve some of the strain off the new colony. Unlike the mainland, Norfolk Island did not have an indigenous population, as it was uninhabited. But, as he was significantly older than most other convicts, John would have been less physically able to perform much manual labour, so he probably would have continued to work as a porter for the authorities in charge of the island. However, Norfolk Island ended up being unsuccessful, and due to the creation of Van Diemen's Land, now called the much worse name of Tasmania, all convicts were slowly moved off in the early 1800s. Today's long-term impact of this detachment of convicts sent to Norfolk Island is that it is still inhabited today. About 1,700 people, or about 30 full buses, live there today, and its main industries are fishing and tourism. Unfortunately, the flax and pine tree industry still has not taken off. John Hart would never leave Norfolk Island, however, as he died on the 3rd of January, 1795, almost 10 years to the day that he was originally sentenced to transportation. He was 54 when he died, making him quite old for the time period. It is unknown whether the pair had any children, or when Flora died. as it is not recorded.